All right, Joel, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin by thanking all of our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our annual Talmud Torah sponsor, the Tilsim Mishpacha Eretz Yisrael, for dedicating all of Sherman Drushos this year as a schus for Besoros Tovos for Am Yisrael. Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Elul Haba Aleinu L'Tova, Ben Goldberg, for an aliyah for the neshama of his father, Mr. Leonard Goldberg, Avram Ben Asher Pinchas Zichron Lebracha, his mother Peggy Fega Rezel Bas Zelig Zichron Lebracha, and the hope that all of the tzilos of our beautiful Kehillah Meretz Hashem will be answered in Chodesh Elul and in the months ahead. Shmuley and Liba Dinovitz, Le'ilui Nishmas David Flum's father, Rabbi Ari Flum, Harav Yitzchak Aryeh Ben Achaver, Rabbi Yaakov Zichrono Livracha. And our day of learning sponsor, Mark Gaylor, in memory of his grandfather, David Shlomo Ben Yerucham Fischel, whose yahrzeit is today, Dalet Elul. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah, the families ein nechama, all of those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. Kadosh Baruch Hu should bring home all of our hostages and allow our holy soldiers to be successful. B'chol maaseh yedehem. Well, so with that, let us begin. We have a lot to do today. Really great daf ahead. Well, every day is a great daf. A great daf ahead of us. Today's daf is Ayin Aleph 71, and we are picking up Emirat Hashem on Ayin Amud Beis 70b. I believe we left off with Tashma. Rabbi Shmuel Silber, correct? What? Meisvei? Okay, perfect. It was a good try, though. All right, again, the Gemara says as follows. 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18. Okay, approximately 19 lines up from the bottom. Meisvei. So remember again, we're doing it, just to reorient ourselves a little bit. So remember, we're doing the whole sugya of mirsas. What's the sugya of mirsas? That essentially, if I leave my wine with an akum, under what circumstances do I have to be concerned that he tampered with it and therefore made it into yayin esech? Or ultimately, again, under what circumstances could I assume that he left it alone and it's still therefore again kosher? Essentially, everything comes down to the following: an akum will go ahead and tamper with wine when essentially there are two factors in play. Number one, he could find a reasonable reason as to why he's in proximity to the wine. Right? There's a good story as to why he's there. And number two, he's confident that the Jew isn't popping up out of nowhere. If you have those two criteria, then the wine is going to be problematic. Missing any one of those two criteria would make the assumption that the akum is not tampering with the wine. So the Gemara says, and then we got into an interesting discussion between Rav and Rabbi Yochanan, and we were making the assumption that whatever applies for taras, so whatever applies ultimately, again, let's say for the ritual purity of tahar food items, whether that's truma, meiser, or ultimately, I guess someone also is like, let's say, makbetit is chulin betara, even his unconsecrated food in tara, whatever applies for taras certainly applies for wine as well. The Gemara says, meisvei, rarei zekasha, hapnim shel chaver v'chitzon shel amaretz. Well, this is actually an interesting case. So let's say you have a chaver and you have an amaretz who are neighbors. Now what they have is they have two adjacent fields, but the way that or two adjacent homes, but the way that their homes are set up is so to speak, the chaver lives on the inside and the amaretz lives on the outside, which means the only way for the chaver, let's say, to access his home is through the chutzner of the am haaretz. Right? The chaver doesn't have another way to access his home. So the halacha is like this: hapanim shel chaver, v'chitzon shel amaretz, also chaver shoteach shamperos, umaniach sham kelim, v'afal pi shel am haaretz magas shel amaretz magas l'sham. So the halacha is that the chaver could go ahead and put out his produce, could go ahead and put out his kelim in his chutzner, even though technically speaking, the am haaretz could reach from his chutzner into the chutzner of the chaver. To which the Gemara says kashi l'Rav. So there's a kasha on Rav, right? Because Rav said that halacha l'maisa in the previous case, where let's say an am haaretz and the chaver had adjacent fields, and there was just a very low mechitza in between those two fields. So Rav said ultimately that the chaver has to assume that his taros are tamei because the am haaretz could reach over. Sekash l'Rav, Amalach Rav, shiny house. In this case is different. Why? Shenitbas alav keganov. There's no feasible reason why the am haaretz would ever be found in the chutzner of the chaver. See, Rabbi say, remember the case over here is The only way for the chaver to access his field is through the Am Ha'aretz's field. The Am Ha'aretz has absolutely no reason to be in the chaver's property. So because of that, he has no feasible reason to be there. Because he has no feasible reason to be there, therefore we assume he's not going to tamper with the produce. So Tashma, Rabbi Shmuel says as follows: Gago shel chaver lemala mi gago shel Am Ha'aretz. So I'll say, so interestingly enough, let's say you have two roof lines. The roof of the chaver and the roof of the Am Ha'aretz. The roof of the chaver is higher than the roof of the Am Ha'aretz. So what's the halacha? Also, chaver shoteach shampero. So when the achsham kelim, ultimately again the chaver could go ahead and put out his produce, his tahar produce. He could put out his tahar kelim. Ubilvad shelo tehei yado shel Am Ha'aretz maga'as l'sham. As long as we are confident that the Am Ha'aretz doesn't have the ability to reach over onto the roof of the chaver. So says the Gemara, Kash Rabbi Yochanan. There's Kash Rabbi Yochanan, because Rabbi Yochanan said before in the side-by-side chatzar case that the chaver need not be concerned about physical contact between his produce and the Am Ha'aretz. Rabbi Yochanan said like this: Shiny Hasam, the Islay li ishtamute. It's different there, because there the Am Ha'aretz could come up with a good cover story as to why his hand is in the roof space of the chaver. What he could say, Amar imitsure kamatzra. He could tell you, I'm measuring space. I want to see how much space is between my roof and your roof. I'm thinking about building up my roof. I'm taking measurements. So because he can make an excuse about taking measurements, he has a good alibi for why he's there. Because he has an alibi, ultimately there's a concern that he's going to be there and he's going to touch that which does not belong to him. The Gemara goes weiter. Tashma. Gago shel chaver b'tzad gago shel Am Ha'aretz. So let's say you have two opposite rooftops, right? So one belongs to the chaver, one belongs to the Am Ha'aretz. Osa chaver shoteach shampero. So when the achsham kelim, so the chaver is allowed to put out produce, allowed to put out his utensils. V'afal pi sheyado shel Am Ha'aretz maga'as l'sham. Even though technically speaking, the Am Ha'aretz could ultimately reach there. To which the Gemara says, Kashi l'Rav. This is a question on Rav. So Rav says, why are you asking kashas on me? At the end of the day, there's another opinion. Who's the other opinion? This is the opinion of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. I hold on the Amri Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. I like Rabbi Shimon Gamliel. Okay, so I'll say, so bottom line, what are the takeaways here? So takeaways number one, ultimately again, are that halacha l'maisa, this is how we started, that if you're going to leave your wine with an akum, there have to be two factors present in order for the wine not to become yayin esech. Number one, I have to be going in a way where the akum never knows when I'm coming back, and that I can pop up without being detected, right? That creates what we call a mirses, a sense of fear of being discovered. Second of all, the akum has to have a good reason as to why he would, or has to have a good alibi, a story, as to why he would be in close proximity to the wine. If he doesn't have that story or alibi, I don't have to worry about my wine, because I'm assuming he's not going to tamper it, because an akum only tampers with wine when he assumes that he's not going to be discovered. Okay, incredible. Says the Mishnah. So we'll say along these same themes. Boleshes shenichnas al'ir. So we'll say Boleshes, Rashi says, is chayil ashem shemechapsin v'chosrin karle Boleshes. This is a group of soldiers. A group of soldiers that come into a city. This is interesting. B'shas shalom, if they're coming into a city at a time of peace. And what's the halacha? Chavios psuchos asuros. Any open barrels of wine will be aser, but ultimately stumos mutaros. Closed barrels of wine will be mutter, right? Because the assumption is the soldiers will go into any open barrels of wine, but they will not go ahead and open up any sealed barrels of wine. Bishas milchama, but if it's a time of war, elu v'elu mutaros. Ultimately, both open barrels and sealed barrels are mutter. Why? Lefi she'ein pinai lenasech. Because during wartime, there's no time for libations. There's no time for libations. I will say, by the way, and here you could see the fundamental distinction between the yid and the akum. See, the akum in times of distress has absolutely no time for his avoda Zara, right? The yid in times of distress cannot get enough of the Ribono Shel Olam. Because ultimately, again, it's in general, in times of stress and distress is where you see the true mettle a nature of a person, right? Like the Gemara says, there are three ways that you could see the true nature of a person: koso, kiso, and kaaso, right? Ultimately, what happens when he drinks? How does he spend his money? And what does he get upset about? So at least two out of those three, money and anger, represent how you deal in times of stress. How do you deal in stressful situations? Because at the end of the day, when I'm not stressed, I could put on a good show, right? When I'm not stressed, I could put on a very calm exterior. When I encounter stress, when I encounter difficult situations, that's when the true me comes out. So I will say it's incredible. So now war is a pretty big stressor. So the Gemara says, what does the Akum do during war? He turns away from his deity because deep down he probably knows that it's not going to help him anyway. But yet what does the Yid do in times of distress? I cling to HaKadosh Baruch Hu simply as much as I can. Incredible. So the Gemara is the Kasha, top of Ayin Aleph, or Mini. The Gemara says, so based on this Mishnah, the Mishnah says essentially that when an Akum, right, in times of war, the Akum is not worshiping his deity. Right? He's not libationalizing. Therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, all of the barrels of wine, whether they're sealed or they're open, are going to be mutter because he didn't make it yayin nesach. 1 second. Or mini, if you have a city which was conquered, ultimately again, which was conquered, what's the halacha? And this is by a Gentile army. Kol kohanos shebesocha besulos. All of the wives of Kohanim become asura to their husbands. Now, I will say a very dramatic halacha, which certainly requires a lot more explanation. But on the most basic level, what are we concerned about? That when Gentile soldiers occupy a city, what are they doing? They're violating the women. The halacha is that the wife of a Kohen becomes asura. Normally, if the wife of a Yisrael, chas v'shalom, is violated, she remains permitted to her husband. The wife of a Kohen, if she chas v'shalom is violated, becomes prohibited to her husband. So the Gemara says, if you have a city that was besieged or conquered by a Gentile army, you have to assume that the women were violated. So what's the kasha of the Gemara? So I don't understand. You just made it sound in the Mishnah that during wartime, people have no time for anything but war. But here it sounds like the soldiers have time for immoral conduct. If they have a time for immoral conduct, why wouldn't we say they're worshiping idolatry as well? Well, says incredible Gemara. Amar Mari, lenasech ein pnai, lival yesh pnai. They have no time for idolatry. But there's always time for immorality, right? In other words, we'll say, and this, by the way, this is in line ultimately again with what we saw in yesterday's daf. Also, it's fascinating, the same theme 2 days in a row, right? What we were saying yesterday about the Jews who are sitting down and having wine with the non-Jewish zona, just because they're going to engage in immorality doesn't mean that they're going to engage in idolatry. So remember again, essentially, the Yetzer Hara for immorality is much stronger than the Yetzer Hara for idolatry. And this is talking about by non-Jews. Allah has come certainly by Jews as well. So therefore, again, the Gemara says, you're right, during wartime, they're not worshiping their idolatry. Right? But during wartime, unfortunately, they are still engaging in immoral practices. Incredible. The Mishnah goes weiter. Ha'omdin shel Yisrael, so what's another interesting case here? Ha'omdin shel Yisrael, sheshalach lahem oved kochavim chavis shel yayin nesach b'schara. So watch this case. Watch this case. So you have workers, right, Jewish workers, who work for a non-Jew. Okay? So now what happened? It's payday. So, right, Akum has to pay his workers, Jewish workers. What does he do? He wants to pay them in a barrel of yayin nesach. Right? So let's say again, I worked for the Akum. I go ahead, I earned $1,000. He's like, great, I have a fantastic barrel of aged yayin nesach. I'm giving it to you as your wage. Okay, so what's the halacha? So we'll say, so obviously, we understand what's the problem. So if we remember nothing else, what we do know is, yayin nesach is asr ba'ano. You can't get benefit from it. So now what do I do? This is very interesting. The Gemara says, listen to this. So what I can say to the Akum is, Akum, do me a favor. I don't want the barrel of wine. So why don't you sell the wine? You sell the wine and just pay me with the proceeds. So I can get paid with the proceeds of the yayin nesach. Now, why is that? Because I have never taken possession of the yayin nesach. So as long as I've never taken possession of it, it's never entered into my domain, it's not mine. Because it's not mine, therefore, halacha l'maaseh, again, I have no shaykhs to it. So when the akum sells it off, he's selling off his own possessions. I don't care if he sells off yayin nesach or he sells his car. It doesn't make a difference to me. I'm allowed to then be paid with the proceeds of that particular sale. So we'll look at Rashi for just a moment. First Rashi in the Mishnah, second of the short lines. Rashi says, because I didn't acquire the barrel of wine, right? The akum is obligated to me in money. Good. Suppose it's there. That's case number one. Case number two is if I get the barrel of wine, right? I acquire the barrel of wine, and you can understand this in a very simple way. Akum shows up at my door, says, Silber, I want to pay you. Here's a barrel of wine, it's worth $1,000. I take it, and then he tells me, oh, by the way, it's yayin nesach. It's yayin nesach. Now I have a problem. What's my problem? Because again, I will say, what happens with yayin nesach that becomes owned by a Jew? That's asur ba'ana. That's asur ba'ana. So interestingly enough, if I never take possession of the wine, I can tell the akum, no thank you, you sell it, give me the proceeds. Once I take possession of the wine, it's mine. Then it becomes Avoda Zara owned by a Jew. And Avoda Zara owned by a Jew really has no recourse except being destroyed. So it says the Gemara, I'm Rabbi Yehuda Motza the Adam Lomar, the Ovid Kochavim, say, V'hafeis alai manas hamelach. So Rav says, using the same idea, Rav says, I could say to my akum neighbor, so I'll say, for example, it's tax time. I have to pay my taxes. So I could say to the akum, do me a favor, go and take care of my tax bill for me, and I'll pay you back. I'll pay you back. Now, what's the chiddush in this? The chiddush in this is that even though, let's say, I know that the akum is going to use yayin nesach to pay off the debt. Look at Rashi for just a moment. Say, v'hafeis alai manas hamelech, arnona, tax. She'nosin mitvu osein, memosein, isur. V'yisor zeh shechayiv l'seis l'melech yayin, mutter lo me la'ovei kochavim hafeis alai. Af agav dikol yoev hay ovei kochavim yayin nesach, v'hay Yisrael pari dameha, kevan dahavi matzi l'seluke l'shlicha demalka bezuzi, ki yoev le'ovei kochavim yayin nesach lav shluche de'Yisrael. Listen to this. So essentially, there's a tax, right? And therefore, I was obligated to go ahead and give, 10 barrels of wine. So I tell my akum neighbor, can you take care of my tax bill and I'll pay you back. I'll pay you back. Akum says, no problem. He uses yayin nesach. Ultimately, again, I'm still allowed to pay him back. Why? Now, Rashi explains because the way this particular tax worked is although it's a tax on produce, you could also pay it off in money. So because of that, I don't really care if the akum uses yayin nesach, he uses whatever it is. I'm paying him a financial debt that is not really related to yayin nesach. In other words, the particular item that he used to pay the debt is really irrelevant to me. What I just need him to do is take care of my tax bill, and I'm going to pay him back. So this ultimately, again, is going to be mutter. So Mari Zakasha Meisvei, Al Yomer Adam La'ovei Kochavim, Ol Tachtai La'otzar. So listen to this. So the Brisa says as follows. I can't say to my Gentile neighbor, Ol Tachtai, literally again, come in my place to the ruler. They will say, now what? Same case, it's a tax. Rashi says, Ol Tachtai La'otzer, Hikanis Bimkomi Lahafis es Hashoter, Kimoze Yatzar. So the idea over here is, I owe the local ruler money. I owe him $1,000 in taxes to the local governor. I can't say to the akum, stand in my place to pay my debt, and I'll pay you back. Again, this is presupposing, of course, he's going to use yayin nesach to go out and pay this off. So ultimately, again, I can't do that. I both say it's contrary to what I just said before, because Rav said, I can ask my akum neighbor to pay off my tax bill, even though I know he's going to use yayin nesach. So why is this case different? To which the Gemara says, Amrlei Rav, Ol Tachtai La'otzer Ka'amrit? No. This is different. We'll say, why is this different? Look at the lashon that's being used. Ol Tachtai. What does Ol Tachtai mean? Stand in my place. So this is literally where the Jew is saying to the akum, I need you to be my shaliach. So if the Jew is creating shlichus with the akum, it's literally creating agency, and the akum is going to use yayin nesach, then indeed that is problematic. That is problematic. The Gemara says, Halo damya, this is only comparable to the case, Allah aval omer lo malteni mina otzer. So the Gemara is just interestingly enough going ahead and making a distinction, ultimately again, because between lashon of like do me a favor or help me out and stand in my place. When I ask the akum for a favor, he's not acting as my agent. He's taking care of something for me, but agency has not been created. Because agency hasn't been created, therefore, again, whatever the akum uses for payment, whether it's yain nesach or money or wheat, doesn't matter to me. When I use lashon of ol tachtai, stand in my place, that's creation of agency. Where there's creation of agency, then if the akum actually uses yain nesach, it's viewed as if I am actually carrying this out, and of course that's going to be problematic. Okay, interesting. Says the Mishnah next. So interesting case, Yabosai. I'm selling wine to an akum. So what happens? Pasak ad shalo madad. So Yabosai say if halacha we came to pasak means we came to agreement on price. We went ahead and we came to agreement on price, right? Aval lo madad, achelo madad. This was before the akum poured out the wine for himself. So for example, let's say I have a barrel of wine, I'm selling it to the akum. Akum wants to buy 3 gallons. So I go ahead and we agree on a price. After we agree on the price, then the akum pours off the wine into his container. So look at Rashi for just a moment. Pasak imam maus. So we agreed on a price. Achelo madad. Before the akum, before anything was poured off into the utensils, well, we'll see whose utensils is poured off into. Damav mutarin. Ultimately, again, so the proceeds are mutar. I'm allowed to keep. No, say. Now, remember, what would be the problem over here? So the assumption over here is that, remember, wine that belongs to an akum becomes yayin nesach. So the idea over here is I'm transacting business. This is my wine right now. But it's ultimately, again, going to an akum. So what's the concern? The concern over here is the wine becoming yayin nesach before the transaction is finalized. Because then I have a potential problem of getting benefit from yayin nesach. So therefore, again, the Mishnah says, if we agree on price before any wine is poured off, then the proceeds ultimately become permitted. Just look at that first Rashi in the Mishnah there. I just want to show you this. Mefarish b'Gemara, Taima ika demuki la mishum mashicha ba'ovei kochavim kana. Hilchach kishemodei tainu mashicha v'kanye ovei kochavim miyad dahavile li Yisrael zuzi gabei dovei kochavim ba'ava v'yayinesach lo havi adina gabei. So both say, so essentially, there are multiple parts in this process, right? In this transaction, ultimately, again, first, we have to agree on price. Second, what ends up happening? The Oved Kochavim lifts up, let's say the barrel, and goes ahead and pours it, or I'm lifting it up and pouring it. But the assumption over here is that he's lifting it up and pouring it. That's going to be Mashicha or Hagbah, right? He's taking possession of it. At that point of time, it becomes his. When does it become Yayin Nesach? Yayin Nesach occurs, well, we're going to see for now, we're assuming Yayin Nesach occurs when the akum touches the wine. So therefore, as long as we've agreed on price prior to the akum having any contact with wine, the deal is considered to be done. And therefore, again, as soon as the akum lifts it up, before it even touches the wine itself, it becomes his. And therefore, the proceeds ultimately are permitted. Whatever happens to the wine afterwards, I don't care. I don't care because I have my money, or at least I'm entitled to my money already. Good. The Gemara says, however, ad shelo pasak tamav asurin. If, however, the akum went ahead and lifted the wine and poured the wine before there was an agreement on price, ultimately, again, the wine is going to be aser. Now, what's the reason for this? Look at Rashi. Madad achalo pasak damav asur, and Rashi says, so now watch this. Because if we didn't agree on price, when the Oved Kochavim lifts up the wine, ultimately, again, I'm not giving it over to him. Because without an agreement on price, I'm not conveying ownership of anything. And therefore, even when he does Mashicha, even when he lifts it or he pulls it, he has not acquired it. Therefore, Hilchach kinagabe haviyayin esech di Yisrael. Therefore, when the akum, if he ends up touching the wine, is considered to be yayin esech that belongs to a Jew. What's the halacha with yayin esech that belongs to a Jew? Can't get any level of benefit from this. Therefore, we'll say, so watch how this case works. So again, I'm selling my wine to an akum. So the Mishnah says I have to be careful here, right? Because if he takes possession of this wine before the transaction is complete, right? Or I should say differently, he touches the wine before the transaction is complete, we have a problem. What's the problem? He's made my wine into yayin nesach, and I can't get any subsequent benefit from that. So therefore, the Mishnah says, here's the way it works. If we have step one, agreement on price. If we're agreed on price, step two, when the akum lifts up the wine, he acquires it. He acquires it, he's now acquired his wine. Once he's acquired his wine, that means now I have a debt by him, right? So now the transaction is done. Transaction is done. He owes me money, but the wine is his. What's the beauty of that? He's lifted the wine. He's lifted the wine in a container. Now remember again, does lifting wine in a container make the wine yayin nesach? No. When does it become yayin nesach? When he actually touches the wine itself. So now what's ended up happening over here, which is very good, is he's lifted the wine, Mashicha, Hagbah, he's acquired it. He now owes me my money, Shalom al Yisrael. The problem is if he begins to lift it and subsequently touch it before we've agreed on price, the transaction's not done. Because the transaction's not done, when he's lifting and touching, what is he doing? He's lifting and touching my wine. Because of that, there's the strong possibility that my wine has become yayin nesach. Yayin nesach of a Jew, what's the halacha? Can't do anything with it. It says the Gemara, Amra Meimar, Meshicha b'avikochavim kona. So Amir says, what do you see from here? That Meshicha, buying akum is an effective form of kinyan. Teda dahani parsoi mishadri pardeshani lahada. Divalahadri. How do we know this? So first of all, Amemar said these Persians, they send each other gifts, and no one ever has the ability to demand the gift back. Right? What does that show you? What does that show you? That shows you that once one of the parties goes out and does mashicha, right, ultimately takes possession of it, it's no backsies. Ravashi says no. No. Perhaps mashicha is only a kinyan by Jews, and mashicha does not work by an akum. So the Gemara says, but what about the Persian gifts? The reason why the Persians don't give back gifts, ultimately, again, is because of arrogance, right? Either arrogance on the part of the recipient, I'm not giving this back, or arrogance, right? That's the pashtos, what this is. It's arrogance. So Rabbi says, it's an interesting fundamental machlokes. Does Mashiach work by an akum? Ravashi, menaminah. So Ravashi says, from where do I know this? That ultimately, again, Mashiach by an akum doesn't work. So listen to this. Mida amar lahu Rav lahano savyusa. So listen to this. Rav said to the Savyusa are wine merchants. Ki kailisu chamar la'ovei kochavim shakli zuzi minayu v'hadar kailon. It's interestingly enough. So Rav said like this: when you are going ahead and measuring out wine for ovdei kochavim, make sure to get your money first, and then go ahead and measure it out for them. Why? V'ilo. Now, interestingly enough, and let's say the akum doesn't have money on him, right? He doesn't have cash. So what should you do? V'ilo nakitu ba'adayu zuzi. Always keep extra cash with you, and usfinhu, lend your money to the akum. Right? So lend him money for the purchase, and then what? V'hadar shakli minayu ki hechi detehavi halva gabayu. So this was the eitzah. This was the eitzah ultimately, again, that Rav gave to these individuals, right? And Rav said that halacha l'maisa, again, when you're selling wine, ultimately, again, to an akum, make sure, get your money first, measure out afterwards, right? And if they don't have money, so lend them money, and then ultimately, again, they'll pay you with that, and then they'll owe you money afterwards. Why? The Gemara says, V'ilo, good. V'ilo, because if you don't do this, avdisu hachi, if the love hachi, ki kahavi yayinesech birshu saichu ka. So we'll say, what kahavi? What's the problem? Because if you don't do this, then the concern is that if the akum touches the wine, ultimately, again, he is going to end up making it yayin esech while it is still in your possession. And ultimately, again, when you take money, you're going to end up taking money for what is yayin esech. Someone else says, 1 second. But if you think that Mashiach really works by an akon, we'll say Amud Beis, Ayin Alpha Beis 71b. If you think that Mashiach works, so I don't understand. Then we'll say, even if we didn't agree on price, halacha l'maisa, when the Oved Kochavim lifts the barrel, let's say, that's Mashicha. That's Hagbah, right? When he pulls it close to him, that's Mashicha. He acquires it. And therefore, even if it subsequently becomes Yayin Nesach, it's becoming Yayin Nesach in whose possession? In the Akum's possession, right? And it does become Yayin Nesach until you touch it. So Gemara says, 1 second. Either kakayel verami lamana di Yisrael hachanami. So the truth is, the Gemara says, you're right. If we're talking about over here a situation where you were measuring it into the utensil of the Yisrael, then ultimately, again, you would be right. You would be right. The Gemara says, lo tzricha the kakayel verami lamana da oved kochavim. Interesting enough, we'll say, what's the case over here? The case is where the wine is being measured and poured into a utensil of the akum. Look at Rashi for just a moment. The Manad of Ikochavim, Sigmar says, Diyayin Shebekli Osro, Vahaviyayin Nesech Mikame Meshicha. So we'll say, see, interestingly enough, what's the issue over here? The issue is that when you pour wine into the utensil of an akum, so the assumption is that that utensil itself, there may be previous droplets of wine in there, and therefore, again, halacha l'maisa, the wine that's poured in becomes yain nesach. So we'll say, so just so you appreciate over here kind of the progression a little bit. So the akum is buying wine from me. Akum is buying wine from me. So again, everyone is agreeing that let's go like this. So the way this would work is normally I would take from my barrel, pour from my barrel into a smaller utensil, right? Because the akum is not buying the whole barrel, pouring into a smaller utensil, and then the akum does mashicha. So the Gemara says like this. The Gemara says, we wants to suggest that even if we don't agree on price beforehand, the wine ultimately, again, should still be mutter if you hold that Mashicha works by an akum. Why? Because let me pour it into my utensil. The akum could do Mashicha. He acquires the wine. Wine doesn't become yayin nesach until you actually touch it. To which the Gemara says, 1 second, what are we dealing with over here? Where I'm pouring my wine into the utensil of the akum. Oh, that changes everything. Because if it's in the utensil of the akum, the assumption is that there are wine droplets previously there. Those wine droplets are yayin nesach. Once I pour the wine into the utensil of the akum, the new wine becomes yayin nesach immediately by coming into the utensil. The problem now here is that it's yayin nesach even before Mashicha. If it's yayin nesach before Mashicha, then what? Then it's my yayin nesach. If it's my yayin nesach, then we have a problem because I can't get hana from yayin nesach. To which the Gemara says, sof, I don't stand still. Kimata la'avira demana kanya yayin nesach lo havi ad demati la'arase demana. So this is very interesting. So the Gemara says, essentially, but 1 second, when does a utensil acquire? A utensil acquires object once the object is in the airspace of the utensil. When does the poured wine become yayin nesach? Only when? Presumably only once it hits the bottom of the utensil where there are droplets of yayin nesach already there, which should then mean that technically speaking, the akum should acquire the wine when it comes into the airspace of his kli, which is even before the wine becomes potentially yayin nesach, in which case the transaction should be permitted. To which the Gemara says, what do you see from here? Shmamina nitzuk chibur. All right, a lot going on over here. So the Gemara says, what do you see from here? You see that nitzuk, a flow or a stream, creates a connection. I've also we've seen this before. That essentially, when you have a stream of liquid, does the stream create a connection between the point of origin and the destination? So Rabbi Gemara says, you see from here, it does. Why? So watch this. So what does this mean? Therefore, what this means is like this. When I'm pouring the wine into the utensil of the akum, so because that bottom stream ultimately is hitting the bottom of the kli, and on the bottom of the kli are droplets of yayin nesach, the bottom of the stream is connected to the top of the stream and is considered to be one continuous harmonious unit, and therefore it's all yayin nesach. Even the wine that hasn't hit the bottom, ultimately is still considered to be yayin nesach. All right, very interesting. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, good. Lo. So the Gemara says, no, not necessarily. So we'll say, so this all makes sense if the akum is holding the utensil in his hand. The Gemara says, lo tzricha the manech a'ara. Ultimately, again, rather it is the Oved Kochavim's utensil is actually sitting on the ground itself. V'tikni lekelav. So ultimately, again, so why don't the utensils of the akum acquire it on his behalf? Shamas mina learned from here. Kelav shalokech b'rishus mocher lokana lokech. So what do you see from here? That the utensils of a purchaser cannot acquire on his behalf when they are situated in the domain of the seller. To which the Gemara says once again, lo the olam emalacha kana lokech. Not true. Normally, we say the utensils of a purchaser do have the ability to acquire in the property of the seller. Also, we've seen this before also because essentially the utensils of the purchaser almost become like the chutzner of the purchaser. What's the case over here? The ika akavas yayin apume to kuznasa. The kama in sachle. What's what I will say? There are droplets of yayin nesach wine. Where are they situated? Not like we thought on the bottom of the utensil, but rather where? On the lip of the utensil. So that literally, the moment that the new wine comes into this utensil of the akum, it is almost instantaneously and immediately rendered yayin nesach. Ukiman, and we'll say whose opinion doesn't, Ukiman, the low Reb Shimon Gamliel. Is Reb Shimon Gamliel? Why? The Reb Shimon Gamliel, ha'amar, himacher kulo la'ovdei kochavim, chutz midimei yayin nesach shebo. Because Rabbi Gamliel says any time that halacha l'maisa you have a mixture of yayin nesach in something, no problem. Just exclude from the sale the value of the yayin nesach itself. You can keep the rest. To which the Gemara says, "Midi hutaima el Rav." This is only applicable according to Rav. Hamarav, because we'll say this whole thing is Rav. Hamarav halach Reb Shimon Gamliel. Yeah, Rav said the halacha is like Reb Shimon Gamliel when chavis b'chavis, when you have barrels getting mixed together with other barrels. Aval yayin b'yayin lo. But ultimately, again, if it's actual mixture of wine, even Rabbi Shimon would say the whole thing is going to be aser. Okay, incredible. So where is the kasha? Macy's. We'll say, let's just pause here to catch our breath for just a second. What is it exactly that is happening over here? So remember again, the Mishnah, just to follow our progression again, right? So the Mishnah is telling me that halacha l'maisa, you have to be careful when you sell wine to an akum, right? What am I concerned about? What's my major concern over here? My major concern is if I don't choreograph this correctly, what's going to happen? The wine will become yayin nesach while I still own it. That's what I'm concerned about over here. And if the wine becomes yayin nesach before I own it, then what happens? It's done. It's done because yayin nesach owned by a Jew, you can't get any level of benefit from it. So the Mishnah is trying to teach me how to choreograph a wine transaction with an akum to ensure that I could keep my money, right? So the Mishnah said the way ultimately to do this is agree on price. Once you agree on price, halacha l'maisa, the transaction is pretty much locked in. Then subsequently, when the akum does mashicha, right, when he takes the utensil into his possession, ultimately, again, it's already his. And if it subsequently becomes yayin nesach, I don't care. It's not mine. So we'll say, now interestingly enough, the Gemara's understanding over here, so the Mishnah seems to presuppose that Mashicha is a form of kinyan that works by an akum, right? Literally pulling something into your domain or pulling something towards you is an acquisitory act that works by an akum. The Gemara just says, by the way, that's a machlokes. Ameimar says, yes, it does. Rav Ashi says, no, it doesn't. This then gave birth to a whole new subject, which we're in now about. So essentially, we're in the midst of that machlokes. Good. Says the Gemara. Meisvei, interesting case here. Halokeach grutaos mina ovdei kochavim. Listen to this. I buy pieces of metal from an akum. Okay, so the Gemara says, I buy pieces of metal from an akum. So what's the halacha? Good. Yeah, Rashi says, grutos, shivrei ksafim. Pieces of metal from an akum. The nimtzav and avodas kochavim, and in that I find an idol. So what do I do? Im ad shelo nasan maos mashach yasir. So we'll say, so ultimately yachzir. So again, if I haven't paid money, ultimately again, even if I did mashiach already. So we'll say, so in this case over here, I took possession of the metal pieces, but I didn't pay any money. Now I'm looking through the merchandise and I see an idol. Okay, but you haven't paid any money, return it. If you haven't paid for it, return it. Im mishenasan maos mashach. But if I paid the money and I did mashiach, I'm stuck. I'm stuck, it belongs to me, and therefore again I will say, what do I do with the idol? I have to throw it into the Dead Sea, right? I have to get rid of it. I can't get any level of hana from it. Rashi says over here, right? Yachsir de lo kanye velo mechayev levara. So therefore, we'll say what comes out of this is very interesting. When do I acquire something from an akum? When there's two step acquisition. Number one, I paid money. Number two, I did mashicha. But let's say, for example, if I did mashicha, I didn't pay money, right? And then Allah I could return everything back to the akum. So it says the Gemara. So we'll say, we have to make the assumption that if Mashiach works on an akum, then Mashiach should work for a Jew as well. If that's the case, then even when I haven't paid, if I did Mashiach, ultimately, again, I shouldn't be able to return the idol to the owner. Amayaksir, Rabbi says, no, this case is different. Why? Because they both say this whole thing looks like a mekach. What's a mekach? A mekach is a transaction based on mistaken assumptions or circumstances. The most basic level, I go to buy a car. I go to buy a car from Ruvain, and I say I want to buy a Cadillac, and he sells me a Toyota. That's a mekach. That's a mekach. And therefore, again, that is a voidable sale. So therefore, the Gemara says, Abai wants to suggest that when I bought pieces of metal from the akum, and it turns out that there is an idol in there that has the appearance of mekachtos, and therefore, as long as money has not been given, even though there was mashicha, the sale is voidable. Amar Rava says, I don't understand if that's the case. Reisha mekachtos, seif ala mekachtos. I hear that logic. I definitely know what Rav says, but then it should be a mekachtos in both cases. What does it matter if I paid the money or not? If at the end of the day this is a mistaken sale, then it should be voidable whether I paid the money or not. Allah Amarava, Reisha v'seifa mekachtos. In both cases, a mekachtos. But one second, here's the problem. The Brisa said, if I paid the money, I can't return the idol. If I didn't pay the money, I can return. So why the distinction is mekachtos? Reisha, the lo yoev zuzi, lo mischazi kavodas chom yad Yisrael. Because again, in the case where I did not pay the money, so therefore I will say, if I didn't pay the money, then this whole thing does not have the appearance of Avoda Zara in the hands of a Jew. So because of that, it's just easily returnable. Seifa, the yoev zuzi, ultimately again, but the seifa, the second case where I did pay the money, so the Gemara says, mischazi kavodas chom yad Yisrael. That has the appearance of Jewish-owned idolatry. So Jewish-owned idolatry, we'll say, what do you do with it? Yolechana liyam hamelach. Incredible. The Gemara says, so I'll say, we'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up Amir Hashem with this. So again, we're still embedded in this very same conversation, which does Mashiach work by an akum? Doesn't it work by an akum? And again, based on that, the proper mechanism to affect a sale of wine to an akum to be continued and solidified. Tomorrow we'll say, Shkoyach. All right, have a great day, everyone.